Abraham Lincoln was an American politician and lawyer who served as the 16th President of the United States from March 1861 until his assassination in April 1865. Lincoln led the United States through its Civil War, its bloodiest war and perhaps its greatest moral, constitutional, and political crisis. In doing so, he preserved the Union, abolished slavery, strengthened the federal government, and modernized the economy. Born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, Lincoln grew up on the western frontier in Kentucky and Indiana. Largely self-educated, he became a lawyer in Illinois, a Whig Party leader, and was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives, in which he served for 8 years. Elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1846, Lincoln promoted rapid modernization of the economy through banks, tariffs, and railroads. Because he had originally agreed not to run for a second term in Congress, and because his opposition to the Mexican-American War was unpopular among Illinois voters, Lincoln returned to Springfield and resumed his successful law practice. Re-entering politics in 1854, he became a leader in building the new Republican Party, which had a statewide majority in Illinois. In 1858, while taking part in a series of highly publicized debates with his opponent and rival, Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln spoke out against the expansion of slavery, but lost the U.S. Senate race to Douglas. In 1860, Lincoln secured the Republican Party presidential nomination as a moderate from a swing state, though he gained very little support in the slaveholding states of the South. He swept the North and was elected president in 1860. Lincoln's victory prompted 7 Southern slave states to form the Confederate States of America. Before he moved into the White House, no compromise or reconciliation was found regarding slavery and secession. Subsequently, on April 12, 1861, a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter inspired the North to enthusiastically rally behind the Union. As the leader of the moderate faction of the Republican Party, Lincoln confronted radical Republicans, who demanded harsher treatment of the South, war Democrats, who called for more compromise, anti-war Democrats, called Copperheads, who despised him, and irreconcilable secessionists, who plotted his assassination. Politically, Lincoln fought back by pitting his opponents against each other, by carefully planned political patronage, and by appealing to the American people with his powers of oratory. His Gettysburg Address became an iconic endorsement of the principles of nationalism, republicanism, equal rights, liberty, and democracy. Lincoln initially concentrated on the military and political dimensions of the war. His primary goal was to reunite the nation. He suspended habeas corpus, leading to the controversial ex parte Merryman decision, and he averted potential British intervention in the war by defusing the Trent affair in late 1861. Lincoln closely supervised the war effort, especially the selection of top generals, including his most successful general, Ulysses S. Grant. He also made major decisions on Union war strategy, including a naval blockade that shut down the South's normal trade, moves to take control of Kentucky and Tennessee, and using gunboats to gain control of the Southern river system. Lincoln tried repeatedly to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond. Each time a general failed, Lincoln substituted another, until finally Grant succeeded. As the war progressed, his complex moves toward ending slavery include the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Lincoln used the U.S. Army to protect escaped slaves, encouraged the border states to outlaw slavery, and pushed through Congress the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which permanently outlawed slavery. An exceptionally astute politician, deeply involved with power issues in each state, Lincoln reached out to the war Democrats and managed his own re-election campaign in the 1864 presidential election. Anticipating the war's conclusion, Lincoln pushed a moderate view of Reconstruction, seeking to reunite the nation speedily through a policy of generous reconciliation in the face of lingering and bitter divisiveness. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the surrender of Confederate commanding General Robert E. Lee, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton launched a manhunt for Booth, and 12 days later on April 26, Booth was fatally shot by Union Army soldier Boston Corbett. Lincoln has been consistently ranked both by scholars and the public as among the greatest U.S. presidents. Family and childhood. Early life and ancestry. Abraham Lincoln was born February 12, 1809, the second child of Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, in a one-room log cabin on the Sinking Spring Farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky. Lincoln's mother, Nancy, is widely assumed to have been the daughter of Lucy Hanks, although no record of Nancy Hanks' birth has ever been found. Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks were married on June 12, 1806, in Washington County, and moved to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, following their marriage. In 1816, the family moved north across the Ohio River to Indiana, a free, non-slave-holding territory, where they settled in an unbroken forest. Several significant family events took place during Lincoln's youth in Indiana. On October 5, 1818, Nancy Lincoln died of milk sickness, leaving 11-year-old Sarah in charge of a household that included her father, 9-year-old Abraham, and Dennis Hanks, Nancy's 19-year-old orphaned cousin. As a youth, Lincoln disliked the hard labor associated with frontier life. Some of his neighbors and family members thought for a time that he was lazy for all his reading, scribbling, writing, ciphering, writing poetry, etc. Quote, as he grew into his teens, Lincoln took responsibility for the chores expected of him as one of the boys in the household. He also complied with the customary obligation of a son, giving his father all earnings from work done outside the home until the age of 21. In early March 1830, fearing a milk sickness outbreak along the Ohio River, the Lincoln family moved west to Illinois, a non-slave-holding state. They settled on a site in Macon County, Illinois, 10 miles west of Decatur. Marriage and children. Lincoln's first romantic interest was Anne Rutledge, whom he met when he first moved to New Salem. By 1835, they were in a relationship but not formally engaged. She died at the age of 22 on August 25, 1835, most likely of typhoid fever. Late in 1836, Lincoln agreed to a match with Mary if she returned to New Salem. Mary did return in November 1836, and Lincoln courted her for a time. However, they both had second thoughts about their relationship. On August 16, 1837, Lincoln wrote Mary a letter by suggesting he would not blame her if she ended the relationship. She never replied and the courtship ended. In 1840, Lincoln became engaged to Mary Todd, who was from a wealthy slave-holding family in Lexington, Kentucky. He was an affectionate, though often absent, husband and father of 4 children. Robert Todd Lincoln was born in 1843 and Edward Baker Lincoln, Eddie, in 1846. Edward died on February 1, 1850, in Springfield, probably of tuberculosis. Willie Lincoln was born on December 21, 1850, and died of a fever on February 20, 1862. The Lincolns' fourth son, Thomas "Ted" Lincoln, was born on April 4, 1853, and died of heart failure at the age of 18 on July 16, 1871. The deaths of their sons had profound effects on both parents. Later in life, Mary struggled with the stresses of losing her husband and sons. and Robert Lincoln committed her temporarily to a mental health asylum in 1875. Lincoln's father-in-law and others of the Todd family were either slave owners or slave traders. Lincoln was close to the Todds, and he and his family occasionally visited the Todd estate in Lexington. During his term as President of the United States of America, Mary was known to cook for Lincoln often. Since she was raised by a wealthy family, her cooking abilities were simple, but satisfied Lincoln's tastes, which included, particularly, imported oysters. Early career in militia service. Further information. Early life and career of Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln in the Black Hawk War. Lincoln depicted protecting a Native American from his own men in a scene often related about Lincoln's service during the Black Hawk War. In 1832, at age 23, Lincoln and a partner bought a small general store on credit in New Salem, Illinois. Before the election, Lincoln served as a captain in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War. Lincoln served as New Salem's postmaster and later as county surveyor, all the while reading voraciously. He then decided to become a lawyer and began teaching himself law by reading Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and other law books. Of his learning method, Lincoln stated, "I studied with nobody. I admitted to the bar in 1836. Successful on his second run for office, Lincoln served 4 successive terms in the Illinois House of Representatives as a Whig representative from Sangamon County. U.S. House of Representatives, 1847–49. Lincoln in his late 30s as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Photo taken by one of Lincoln's law students around 1846. From the early 1830s, Lincoln was a steadfast Whig and professed to friends in 1861 to be an old-line Whig, a disciple of Henry Clay. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served one 2-year term. He was the only Whig in the Illinois delegation, but he showed his party loyalty by participating in almost all votes and making speeches that echoed the party line. On foreign and military policy, Lincoln spoke out against the Mexican-American War, which he attributed to President Polk's desire for military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. Lincoln emphasized his opposition to Polk by drafting and introducing his spot resolutions. The war had begun with a Mexican slaughter of American soldiers in territory disputed by Mexico, and the U.S. Polk insisted that Mexican soldiers had invaded our territory and shed the blood of our fellow citizens on our own soil. Congress never enacted the resolution or even debated it. The national papers ignored it, and it resulted in a loss of political support for Lincoln in his district. One Illinois newspaper derisively nicknamed him Spotty Lincoln. Realizing Clay was unlikely to win the presidency, Lincoln, who had pledged in 1846 to serve only one term in the House, supported General Zachary Taylor for the Whig nomination in the 1848 presidential election. Prairie Lawyer. Lincoln returned to practicing law in Springfield, handling every kind of business that could come before a prairie lawyer. In 1851, he represented the Alton and Sangamon Railroad in a dispute with one of its shareholders, James A. Barrett, who had refused to pay the balance on his pledge to buy shares in the railroad on the grounds that the company had changed its original train route. Lincoln's most notable criminal trial occurred in 1858 when he defended William "Duff" Armstrong, who was on trial for the murder of James Preston Metzgar. Lincoln rarely raised objections in the courtroom, but in an 1859 case, where he defended a cousin, Peachy Harrison, who was accused of stabbing another to death, Lincoln angrily protested the judge's decision to exclude evidence favorable to his client, instead of holding Lincoln in contempt of court as was expected. The judge, a Democrat, reversed his ruling, allowing the evidence and acquitting Harrison. Slavery and a House divided. By the 1850s, slavery was still legal in the southern United States, but had been outlawed in all the northern states since 1803, including Illinois, whose original 1818 Constitution forbade slavery. Eric Foner contrasts the abolitionists and anti-slavery radical Republicans of the Northeast who saw slavery as a sin, with the conservative Republicans who thought it was bad because it hurt white people and blocked progress. Foner argues that Lincoln was a moderate in the middle, opposing slavery primarily because it violated the republicanism principles of the Founding Fathers, especially the equality of all men and democratic self-government as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. A portrait of Dred Scott. Lincoln denounced the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott v. Sandford as part of a conspiracy to extend slavery. On October 16, 1854, in his Peoria speech, Lincoln declared his opposition to slavery, which he repeated en route to the presidency. In late 1854, Lincoln ran as a Whig for the U.S. Senate. At that time, senators were elected by the state legislature. Nationally, the Whigs had been irreparably split by the Kansas, Nebraska Act and other efforts to compromise on the slavery issue. Lincoln wrote, "I think I am a Whig, but others say there are no Whigs, and that I am an abolitionist." In 1857, 1858, Douglas broke with President James Buchanan, leading to a fight for control of the Democratic Party. Some Eastern Republicans even favored the re-election of Douglas for the Senate in 1858, since he had led the opposition to the Lecompton Constitution, which would have admitted Kansas as a slave state. After the state Republican Party convention nominated him for the U.S. Senate in 1858, Lincoln delivered his House divided speech, drawing on Mark chapter 3:25, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." Quote. Lincoln-Douglas debates and Cooper Union speech. The Senate campaign featured the 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, the most famous political debates in American history. Though the Republican legislative candidates won more popular votes, the Democrats won more seats, and the legislature re-elected Douglas to the Senate. Despite the bitterness of the defeat for Lincoln, his articulation of the issues gave him a national political reputation. On February 27, 1860, New York Party leaders invited Lincoln to give a speech at Cooper Union to a group of powerful Republicans. Lincoln argued that the Founding Fathers had little use for popular sovereignty and had repeatedly sought to restrict slavery. Lincoln insisted the moral foundation of the Republicans required opposition to slavery, and rejected any groping for some middle ground between the right and the wrong. Historian Donald described the speech as a superb political move for an unannounced candidate to appear in one rival's, William H. Seward, own state at an event sponsored by the second rival's, Salmon P. Chase, loyalists, while not mentioning either by name during its delivery. 1860 presidential nomination and campaign. A Timothy Cole wood engraving taken from a May 20, 1860 ambrotype of Lincoln, 2 days following his nomination for president. The rail candidate. Lincoln's 1860 candidacy is depicted as held up by the slavery issue, a slave on the left and party organization on the right. Large head, with high crown of skull. Thick, bushy hair, large and deep eye caverns. Heavy eyebrows, a large nose, large ears, large mouth, thin upper and somewhat thick underlip. very high and prominent cheekbones, cheeks thin and sunken, strongly developed jawbone, chin slightly upturned, a thin but sinewy neck, rather long arms, large hands, chest thin and narrow as compared with his great height, legs of more than proportionate length, and large feet. On May 18, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln's friends promised and manipulated and won the nomination on the third ballot, beating candidates such as William H. Seward and Salmon P. Chase. A former Democrat, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, was nominated for vice president to balance the ticket. Lincoln's success depended on his reputation as a moderate on the slavery issue, and his strong support for Whiggish programs of internal improvements and the protective tariff. On the third ballot, Pennsylvania put him over the top. Pennsylvania iron interests were reassured by his support for protective tariffs. Most Republicans agreed with Lincoln that the North was the aggrieved party, as the slave power tightened its grasp on the national government with the Dred Scott decision and the presidency of James Buchanan. Throughout the 1850s, Lincoln doubted the prospects of civil war, and his supporters rejected claims that his election would incite secession. The Wide Awake Parade was formed in 1860 by Republicans in the northern states to help nominate Abraham Lincoln as the President of the United States. As Lincoln's ideas of abolishing slavery grew, so did his supporters. People of the northern states knew the southern states would vote against Lincoln because of his ideas of anti-slavery and took action to rally supporters for Lincoln. As Douglas and the other candidates went through with their campaigns, Lincoln was the only one of them who gave no speeches. Instead, he monitored the campaign closely and relied on the enthusiasm of the Republican Party. The party did the legwork that produced majorities across the North, and produced an abundance of campaign posters, leaflets, and newspaper editorials. There were thousands of Republican speakers who focused first on the party platform, and second on Lincoln's life story, emphasizing his childhood poverty. The goal was to demonstrate the superior power of free labor, whereby a common farm boy could work his way to the top by his own efforts. Presidency. 1860 election and secession. March 1861 inaugural at the Capitol building. The dome above the rotunda was still under construction. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, beating Democrats Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats, and John Bell of the new Constitutional Union Party. He was the first president from the Republican Party. His victory was entirely due to the strength of his support in the North and West. No ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 southern slave states, and he won only 2 of 996 counties in all the southern states. Lincoln received 1,866,452 votes. Douglas won 376,957 votes. Breckinridge 849,781 votes. And Bell 588,789 votes. Turnout was 82.2%, with Lincoln winning the free northern states, as well as California and Oregon. Douglas won Missouri, and split New Jersey with Lincoln. Although Lincoln won only a plurality of the popular vote, his victory in the Electoral College was decisive. Lincoln had 180 and his opponents added together had only 123. There were fusion tickets in which all of Lincoln's opponents combined to support the same slate of electors in New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. But even if the anti-Lincoln vote had been combined in every state, Lincoln still would have won a majority in the Electoral College. As Lincoln's election became evident, secessionists made clear their intent to leave the Union before he took office the next March. There were attempts at compromise. The Crittenden Compromise would have extended the Missouri Compromise line of 1820. dividing the territories into slave and free, contrary to the Republican Party's Free Soil platform. Lincoln, however, did tacitly support the proposed Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which passed Congress before Lincoln came into office and was then awaiting ratification by the states. That proposed amendment would have protected slavery in states where it already existed and would have guaranteed that Congress would not interfere with slavery without Southern consent. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the Southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Quote, both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Beginning of the war. The commander of Fort Sumter, South Carolina, Major Robert Anderson, sent a request for provisions to Washington, and the execution of Lincoln's order to meet that request was seen by the secessionists as an act of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter, forcing them to surrender, and began the war. Historian Allen Nevins argued that the newly inaugurated Lincoln made three miscalculations: underestimating the gravity of the crisis, exaggerating the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South, and not realizing the Southern Unionists were insisting there be no invasion. William Tecumseh Sherman talked to Lincoln during Inauguration Week and was sadly disappointed at his failure to realize that the country was sleeping on a volcano, and that the South was preparing for war. The thunderclap of Sumter produced a startling crystallization of Northern sentiment. Anger swept the land. From every side came news of mass meetings, speeches, resolutions, tenders of business support, the muster of companies and regiments, the determined action of governors and legislatures. Quote, states and Union regiments South in response to Lincoln's call to save the capital and confront the rebellion. On April 19, mobs in Baltimore, which controlled the rail links, attacked Union troops who were changing trains, and local elitist groups later burned critical rail bridges to the capital. The Army responded by arresting local Maryland officials. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in areas the Army felt it needed to secure for troops to reach Washington, assuming command for the Union in the war. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln realized the importance of taking immediate executive control of the war and making an overall strategy to put down the rebellion. Lincoln encountered an unprecedented political and military crisis, and he responded as commander-in-chief. Using unprecedented powers, he expanded his war powers, and imposed a blockade on all the Confederate shipping ports, dispersed funds before appropriation by Congress, and after suspending habeas corpus, arrested and imprisoned thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers. Lincoln was supported by Congress and the Northern public for these actions. In addition, Lincoln had to contend with reinforcing strong Union sympathies in the border slave states and keeping the war from becoming an international conflict. Running the Machine. An 1864 political cartoon takes a swing at Lincoln's administration, featuring William Fessenden, Edwin Stanton, William Seward, Gideon Welles, Lincoln and others. The war effort was the source of continued disparagement of Lincoln, and dominated his time and attention from the start. It was clear that bipartisan support would be essential to success in the war effort, and any manner of compromise alienated factions on both sides of the aisle, such as the appointment of Republicans and Democrats to command positions in the Union Army. Copperheads criticized Lincoln for refusing to compromise on the slavery issue. Conversely, the radical Republicans criticized him for moving too slowly in abolishing slavery. In late August 1861, General John C. Fremont, the 1856 Republican presidential nominee, issued, without consulting his superiors in Washington, a proclamation of martial law in Missouri. He declared that any citizen found bearing arms could be court-martialed and shot, and that slaves of persons aiding the rebellion would be freed. Fremont was already under a cloud with charges of negligence in his command of the Department of the West, compounded with allegations of fraud and corruption. Lincoln overruled Fremont's proclamation. Lincoln believed that Fremont's emancipation was political, neither militarily necessary nor legal. His restraint, his avoidance of any outward expression of truculence, his early softening of State Department's attitude toward Britain, his deference toward Seward and Sumner, his withholding of his own paper prepared for the occasion, his readiness to arbitrate, his golden silence in addressing Congress, his shrewdness in recognizing that war must be averted, and his clear perception that a point could be clinched for America's true position at the same time that full satisfaction was given to a friendly country. Lincoln painstakingly monitored the telegraphic reports coming into the War Department headquarters. He kept close tabs on all phases of the military effort, consulted with governors, and selected generals based on their past success, as well as their state and party. In January 1862, after many complaints of inefficiency and profiteering in the War Department, Lincoln replaced Simon Cameron with Edwin Stanton as War Secretary. Stanton was a staunchly Unionist, pro-business conservative Democrat who moved toward the radical Republican faction. Nevertheless, he worked more often and more closely with Lincoln than any other senior official. Stanton and Lincoln virtually conducted the war together, say Thomas and Hyman. In terms of war strategy, Lincoln articulated two priorities: to ensure that Washington was well defended, and to conduct an aggressive war effort that would satisfy the demand in the North for prompt, decisive victory. Major Northern newspaper editors expected victory within 90 days. General McClellan. After the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run and the retirement of the aged Winfield Scott in late 1861, Lincoln appointed Major General George B. McClellan General-in-Chief of all the Union armies. Lincoln removed McClellan as General-in-Chief in March 1862, after McClellan's Harrison's Landing letter, in which he offered unsolicited political advice to Lincoln urging caution in the war effort. However, lacking requested reinforcements from McClellan, now commanding the Army of the Potomac, Pope was soundly defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run in the summer of 1862, forcing the Army of the Potomac to defend Washington for a second time. Despite his dissatisfaction with McClellan's failure to reinforce Pope, Lincoln was desperate, and restored him to command of all forces around Washington, to the dismay of all in his cabinet but Seward. McClellan then resisted the president's demand that he pursue Lee's retreating and exposed army, while his counterpart General Don Carlos Buell likewise refused orders to move the Army of the Ohio against rebel forces in eastern Tennessee. As a result, Lincoln replaced Buell with William Rosecrans, and, after the 1862 midterm elections, he replaced McClellan with Republican Ambrose Burnside. Both of these replacements were political moderates and prospectively more supportive of the commander-in-chief. Burnside, against the advice of the president, prematurely launched an offensive across the Rappahannock River and was stunningly defeated by Lee at Fredericksburg in December. Not only had Burnside been defeated on the battlefield, but his soldiers were disgruntled and undisciplined. Desertions during 1863 were in the thousands, and they increased after Fredericksburg. The midterm elections in 1862 brought the Republicans severe losses due to sharp disfavor with the administration over its failure to deliver a speedy end to the war, as well as rising inflation, new high taxes, rumors of corruption, the suspension of habeas corpus, the military draft law, and fears that freed slaves would undermine the labor market. The Emancipation Proclamation announced in September gained votes for the Republicans in the rural areas of New England and the upper Midwest, but it lost votes in the cities and the lower Midwest. While Republicans were discouraged, Democrats were energized and did especially well in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and New York. The Republicans did maintain their majorities in Congress and in the major states, except New York. The Cincinnati Gazette contended that the voters were depressed by the interminable nature of this war, as so far conducted, and by the rapid exhaustion of the national resources without progress. In the spring of 1863, Lincoln was optimistic about upcoming military campaigns, to the point of thinking the end of the war could be near if a string of victories could be put together. These plans included Hooker's attack on Lee north of Richmond, Rosecrans on Chattanooga, Grant's on Vicksburg, and a naval assault on Charleston. Hooker was routed by Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May. Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln presents the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet, painted by Francis Bicknell Carpenter in 1864. Lincoln understood that the federal government's power to end slavery was limited by the Constitution, which before 1865 committed the issue to individual states. He argued before and during his election that the eventual extinction of slavery would result from preventing its expansion into U.S. territory at the beginning of the war. He also sought to persuade the states to accept compensated emancipation in return for their prohibition of slavery. Lincoln believed that curtailing slavery in these ways would economically expunge it, as envisioned by the Founding Fathers. Under the Constitution, on June 19, 1862, endorsed by Lincoln, Congress passed an act banning slavery on all federal territory. In July, the Confiscation Act of 1862 was passed, which set up court procedures that could free the slaves of anyone convicted of aiding the rebellion. Although Lincoln believed it was not within Congress's power to free the slaves within the states, he approved the bill in deference to the legislature. He felt such action could only be taken by the commander-in-chief using war powers granted to the president by the Constitution, and Lincoln was planning to take that action. In that month, Lincoln discussed a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinet. In it, he stated that, as a fit and necessary military measure, on January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves in the Confederate States will thenceforward, and forever, be free. Privately, Lincoln concluded at this point that the slave base of the Confederacy had to be eliminated. However, Copperheads argued that emancipation was a stumbling block to peace and reunification. Republican editor Horace Greeley of the highly influential New York Tribune fell for the ploy. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union." The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on September 22, 1862, and put into effect on January 1, 1863, declared free the slaves in 10 states not then under Union control, with exemptions specified for areas already under Union control in 2 states. Once the abolition of slavery in the rebel states became a military objective, as Union armies advanced south, more slaves were liberated until all 3 million of them in Confederate territory were freed. Lincoln's comment on the signing of the proclamation was, "I never, in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." Quote, enlisting former slaves in the military was official government policy after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. By the spring of 1863, Lincoln was ready to recruit black troops in more than token numbers. In a letter to Andrew Johnson, the military governor of Tennessee, encouraging him to lead the way in raising black troops, Lincoln wrote, "The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once." Gettysburg Address. With the great Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, and the defeat of the Copperheads in the Ohio election in the fall, Lincoln maintained a strong base of party support and was in a strong position to redefine the war effort. Despite the New York City draft riots, the stage was set for his address at the Gettysburg Battlefield Cemetery on November 19, 1863. In 272 words and 3 minutes, Lincoln asserted the nation was born not in 1789, but in 1776, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He defined the war as an effort dedicated to these principles of liberty and equality for all. The emancipation of slaves was now part of the national war effort. He declared that the deaths of so many brave soldiers would not be in vain, that slavery would end as a result of the losses, and the future of democracy in the world would be assured. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln concluded that the Civil War had a profound objective, a new birth of freedom in the nation. General Grant. President Lincoln, center-right, with, from left, Generals Sherman and Grant and Admiral Porter. 1868 painting of events aboard the River Queen in March 1865. Meade's failure to capture Lee's army as it retreated from Gettysburg, and the continued passivity of the Army of the Potomac, persuaded Lincoln that a change in command was needed. General Ulysses S. Grant's victories at the Battle of Shiloh and in the Vicksburg campaign impressed Lincoln and made Grant a strong candidate to head the Union Army. Responding to criticism of Grant after Shiloh, Lincoln had said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Quote, nevertheless, Lincoln was concerned that Grant might be considering a candidacy for president in 1864. As McClellan was, Lincoln arranged for an intermediary to make inquiry into Grant's political intentions, and being assured that he had none, submitted to the Senate Grant's promotion to commander of the Union Army. He obtained Congress's consent to reinstate for Grant the rank of lieutenant general, which no officer had held since George Washington. Grant waged his bloody overland campaign in 1864. This is often characterized as a war of attrition, given high Union losses at battles such as the Battle of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. Even though they had the advantage of fighting on the defensive, the Confederate forces had almost as high a percentage of casualties as the Union forces. The Confederacy lacked reinforcements, so Lee's army shrank with every costly battle. Grant's army moved south, crossed the James River, forcing a siege and trench warfare outside Petersburg, Virginia. Lincoln then made an extended visit to Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia. This allowed the president to confer in person with Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman about the hostilities, as Sherman coincidentally managed a hasty visit to Grant from his position in North Carolina. Lincoln authorized Grant to target the Confederate infrastructure, such as plantations, railroads, and bridges, hoping to destroy the South's morale and weaken its economic ability to continue fighting. Grant's move to Petersburg resulted in the obstruction of 3 railroads between Richmond and the South. This strategy allowed Generals Sherman and Philip Sheridan to destroy plantations and towns in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The damage caused by Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia in 1864 was limited to a 60-mile swath, but neither Lincoln nor his commanders saw destruction as the main goal, but rather defeat of the Confederate armies. Mark E. Neely, Jr. has argued that there was no effort to engage in total war against civilians, which he believed did take place during World War II. Confederate General Jubal Early began a series of assaults in the North that threatened the capital. During Early's raid on Washington, D.C. in 1864, Lincoln was watching the combat from an exposed position. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes shouted at him, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot." Quote. As Grant continued to wear down Lee's forces, efforts to discuss peace began. Confederate Vice President Stevens led a group to meet with Lincoln, Seward, and others at Hampton Roads. Lincoln refused to allow any negotiation with the Confederacy as a co-equal. His sole objective was an agreement to end the fighting, and the meetings produced no results. 1864 re-election. While the war was still being waged, Lincoln faced re-election in 1864. Lincoln was a master politician, bringing together, and holding together, all the main factions of the Republican Party, and bringing in war Democrats such as Edwin M. Stanton and Andrew Johnson as well. Lincoln spent many hours a week talking to politicians from across the land and using his patronage powers, greatly expanded over peacetime, to hold the factions of his party together, build support for his own policies, and fend off efforts by radicals to drop him from the 1864 ticket. When Grant's 1864 spring campaigns turned into bloody stalemates and Union casualties mounted, the lack of military success wore heavily on the president's re-election prospects, and many Republicans across the country feared that Lincoln would be defeated. Sharing this fear, Lincoln wrote and signed a pledge that, if he should lose the election, he would still defeat the Confederacy before turning over the White House. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterward. An electoral landslide, in red, for Lincoln in the 1864 election. Southern states, brown, and territories, light brown, not in play. While the Democratic platform followed the peace wing of the party and called the war a failure, their candidate, General George B. McClellan, supported the war and repudiated the platform. Lincoln provided Grant with more troops and mobilized his party to renew its support of Grant in the war effort. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September and David Farragut's capture of Mobile ended defeatist jitters. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. As God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves, and with all nations. Reconstruction. Reconstruction began during the war, as Lincoln and his associates anticipated questions of how to reintegrate the conquered Southern states, and how to determine the fates of Confederate leaders and freed slaves. Shortly after Lee's surrender, a general had asked Lincoln how the defeated Confederates should be treated, and Lincoln replied, "Let 'em up easy." Quote, a political cartoon of Vice President Andrew Johnson, a former tailor, and Lincoln, 1865, entitled "The Rail Splitter," at work repairing the Union. The caption reads, "Johnson, take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I will draw it closer than ever." Lincoln, a few more stitches, Andy, and the good old Union will be mended. As Southern states were subdued, critical decisions had to be made as to their leadership while their administrations were reformed. Of special importance were Tennessee and Arkansas, where Lincoln appointed Generals Andrew Johnson and Frederick Steele as military governors, respectively. In Louisiana, Lincoln ordered General Nathaniel P. Banks to promote a plan that would restore statehood when 10% of the voters agreed to it. Lincoln's Democratic opponents seized on these appointments to accuse him of using the military to ensure his and the Republicans' political aspirations. On the other hand, the Radicals denounced his policy as too lenient, and passed their own plan, the Wade-Davis Bill. In 1864, when Lincoln vetoed the bill, the Radicals retaliated by refusing to seat representatives elected from Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Lincoln's appointments were designed to keep both the moderate and radical factions in harness. To fill Chief Justice Taney's seat on the Supreme Court, he named the choice of the Radicals, Salmon P. Chase, who Lincoln believed would uphold the emancipation and paper money policies. After implementing the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not apply to every state, Lincoln increased pressure on Congress to outlaw slavery throughout the entire nation with a constitutional amendment. Lincoln declared that such an amendment would clinch the whole matter. As the war drew to a close, Lincoln's presidential reconstruction for the South was in flux. Having believed the federal government had limited responsibility to the millions of freedmen, he signed into law Senator Charles Sumner's Freedmen's Bureau bill that set up a temporary federal agency designed to meet the immediate material needs of former slaves. The law assigned land for a lease of 3 years with the ability to purchase title for the freedmen. Lincoln stated that his Louisiana plan did not apply to all states under Reconstruction. Shortly before his assassination, Lincoln announced he had a new plan for Southern Reconstruction. Discussions with his cabinet revealed Lincoln planned short-term military control over Southern states, until readmission under the control of Southern Unionists. It is likely that had he lived, Lincoln would have followed a policy similar to Johnson's, that he would have clashed with congressional radicals, that he would have produced a better result for the freedmen than occurred, and that his political skills would have helped him avoid Johnson's mistakes. Unlike Sumner and other radicals, Lincoln did not see Reconstruction as an opportunity for a sweeping political and social revolution beyond emancipation. He had long made clear his opposition to the confiscation and redistribution of land. He believed, as most Republicans did in April 1865, that the voting requirements should be determined by the states. He assumed that political control in the South would pass to white Unionists, reluctant secessionists, and forward-looking former Confederates. But time and again during the war, Lincoln, after initial opposition, had come to embrace positions first advanced by abolitionists and radical Republicans. Lincoln undoubtedly would have listened carefully to the outcry for further protection for the former slaves. It is entirely plausible to imagine Lincoln and Congress agreeing on a Reconstruction policy that encompassed federal protection for basic civil rights plus limited black suffrage, along the lines Lincoln proposed just before his death. Quote, other enactments. Lincoln adhered to the Whig theory of the presidency, which gave Congress primary responsibility for writing the laws while the executive enforced them. Lincoln vetoed only 4 bills passed by Congress. The only important one was the Wade-Davis bill with its harsh program of Reconstruction. Other important legislation involved 2 measures to raise revenues for the federal government: tariffs, a policy with long precedent, and a new federal income tax. In 1861, Lincoln signed the second and third Morrill Tariff, the first having become law under James Buchanan. Also in 1861, Lincoln signed the Revenue Act of 1861, creating the first U.S. income tax. Lincoln also presided over the expansion of the federal government's economic influence in several other areas. The creation of the system of national banks by the National Banking Act provided a strong financial network in the country. It also established a national currency. In 1862, Congress created, with Lincoln's approval, the Department of Agriculture. In the wake of Grant's casualties in his campaign against Lee, Lincoln had considered yet another executive call for a military draft, but it was never issued. In response to rumors of one, however, the editors of the New York World and the Journal of Commerce published a false draft proclamation, which created an opportunity for the editors and others employed at the publications to corner the gold market. Lincoln's reaction was to send the strongest of messages to the media about such behavior. He ordered the military to seize the 2 papers. The seizure lasted for 2 days. Lincoln is largely responsible for the institution of the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. Judicial appointments. Supreme Court appointments. Lincoln's declared philosophy on court nominations was that, we cannot ask a man what he will do, and if we should, and he should answer us, we should despise him for it. Therefore we must take a man whose opinions are known. Quote, other judicial appointments. Lincoln appointed 32 federal judges, including 4 associate justices and 1 chief justice to the Supreme Court of the United States, and 27 judges to the United States District Courts. Lincoln appointed no judges to the United States Circuit Courts during his time in office. States admitted to the Union. West Virginia, admitted to the Union June 20, 1863, contained the former northwesternmost counties of Virginia that seceded from Virginia after that Commonwealth declared its secession from the Union. As a condition for its admission, West Virginia's constitution was required to provide for the gradual abolition of slavery. Nevada, which became the 3rd state in the far west of the continent, was admitted as a free state on October 31, 1864. Assassination and funeral. Shown in the presidential booth of Ford's Theater. From left to right, our assassin John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, Clara Harris, and Henry Rathbone. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on Good Friday, April 14, 1865, while attending a play at Ford's Theater as the American Civil War was drawing to a close. The assassination occurred 5 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Booth was a well-known actor and a Confederate spy from Maryland. Though he never joined the Confederate Army, he had contacts with the Confederate Secret Service. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, left Ford's Theater during intermission to drink at the saloon next door. The now unguarded president sat in his state box in the balcony. Seizing the opportunity, Booth crept up from behind and at about 10:13 p.m., aimed at the back of Lincoln's head and fired at point-blank range, mortally wounding the president. Major Henry Rathbone momentarily grappled with Booth, but Booth stabbed him and escaped. After being on the run for 12 days, Booth was tracked down and found on a farm in Virginia, some 70 miles south of Washington. After refusing to surrender to Union troops, Booth was killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett on April 26. Dr. Charles Leal, an Army surgeon, found the president unresponsive, barely breathing and with no detectable pulse. Having determined that the president had been shot in the head, and not stabbed in the shoulder as originally thought, he made an attempt to clear the blood clot, after which the president began to breathe more naturally. Lincoln's flag and folded body was then escorted in the rain to the White House by bareheaded Union officers. While the city's church bells rang, President Johnson was sworn in at 10:00 a.m., less than 3 hours after Lincoln's death. The late president lay in state in the East Room, and then in the Capitol Rotunda from April 19 through April 21, for his final journey with his son Willie. Both caskets were transported in the executive coach, United States, and for 3 weeks the Lincoln Special Funeral Train decorated in black bunting. Religious and philosophical beliefs. As a young man, Lincoln was a religious skeptic. In the 1840s, Lincoln subscribed to the doctrine of necessity, a belief that asserted the human mind was controlled by some higher power. Health. Several claims abound that Lincoln's health was declining before the assassination. These are often based on photographs appearing to show weight loss and muscle wasting. One such claim is that he suffered from a rare genetic disorder, meant to be. Historical reputation. In surveys of U.S. scholars ranking presidents conducted since the 1940s, Lincoln is consistently ranked in the top 3, often as number 1. Classical liberal Democrat, an enemy of artificial hierarchy, a friend to trade and business as ennobling and enabling, and an American counterpart to Mill, Cobden, and Bright, whose portrait Lincoln hung in his White House office. Lincoln became a favorite exemplar for liberal intellectuals across Europe and Latin America and even in Asia. Schwartz argues that Lincoln's American reputation grew slowly in the late 19th century until the Progressive era, when he emerged as one of the most venerated heroes in American history, with even white Southerners in agreement. The high point came in 1922 with the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. By the 1970s, Lincoln had become a hero to political conservatives. By the late 1960s, some African-American intellectuals led by Lerone Bennett, Jr., rejected Lincoln's role as the great emancipator. Memory and memorials. Lincoln's portrait appears on 2 denominations of United States currency, the penny and the $5 bill. His likeness also appears on many postage stamps, and he has been memorialized in many town, city, and county names. The most famous and most visited memorials are Lincoln's sculpture on Mount Rushmore. There was also the Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln exhibit in Disneyland, and the Hall of Presidents at Walt Disney World, which had to do with Walt Disney admiring Lincoln ever since he was a little boy. Barry Schwartz, a sociologist who has examined America's cultural memory, argues that in the 1930s and 1940s, the memory of Abraham Lincoln was practically sacred and provided the nation with a moral symbol, inspiring and guiding American life. During the Great Depression, he argues, Lincoln served as a means for seeing the world's disappointments, for making its sufferings not so much explicable as meaningful. Franklin D. Roosevelt, preparing America for war, used the words of the Civil War president to clarify the threat posed by Germany and Japan. Americans asked, what would Lincoln do? Quote, the United States Navy Nimitz-class aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN 72, is named after Lincoln. the second Navy ship to bear his name.